I am really excited to be here tonight with Libby Copeland. She is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture and science. And as a freelance journalist, she's written for the Washington Post, New York Times, The Atlantic, and Smithsonian Magazine. And her book that came out last year is called The Lost Family. Oh, sorry. How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. Explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing and the implications for how we think about family and ourselves and its ramifications for American culture broadly. In the Wall Street Journal, the review called it a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. And the New York Times wrote, "Before you spit in that vial, read this book." The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? And it was recently named to the Guardian's list of the best books of 2020. And I have to say, it really does read like a mystery. I just finished it over the weekend. So welcome, Libby, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm extremely excited to be here. Some of my favorite people live in your area, so there's a personal connection.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna get started with some questions. First thing that I'm sure we're all wondering, how did you come to write this book? What
Yeah.
got you started?
Yeah, so I am a journalist. I've been a journalist for a little over 20 years. I spent the first 10 years of my career at the Washington Post. And at the Post, a lot of the stories you wind up writing because you're in DC are stories that involve having to go through a gatekeeper. I think of these as access journalism stories. So, you have to go through a public relations professional to get your 1 hour in a hotel room with Matt Damon, where you attempt to plumb the depths of his psyche to write a profile that no one's ever read about Matt Damon, for instance, right? Or you are following some politician and you've negotiated for 20 minutes on their campaign plane, right? Where you get to ask them all the burning questions, and then you're just following them like a fly on the wall, trying to put together their personality, and you're trying to capture the essence of John McCain, right? The stories that I loved to write at the Washington Post were the stories, number one, that I came up with about ordinary people that nobody had heard of. And that was because I believed in the idea that we all have stories to tell, and that we can learn from one another, right? And that there are quote unquote ordinary people in extraordinary situations. So I would go looking for those stories on the streets of Washington, D.C. And I did a lot of those kinds of stories. That was always what I loved the most. And I left the Post and I started, writing for a variety of magazines. And those were still the stories that drew me in, right? Questions around human motivation, morality, how we develop our own identities, our personal narratives, right? That stuff, how we define ourselves in the world, I find that fascinating. And that coincided with an interest in science journalism. So I was doing more and more of that. And then about 4 years ago, I started talking to one of my editors at the Washington Post. And it all came together because we were talking about the unexpected consequences of DNA testing. Now, that is sort of the confluence of all this really fascinating stuff. There are a lot of people right now who are seeking their roots. They're trying to understand how all the forces of the past got them to where they are now, how they formed them, maybe in ways they don't even realize. And so there are millions of people, mostly Americans, who have turned to recreational DNA testing to augment their genealogical research. Of those, there's a subset of people, and we can't predict who they are, and they themselves don't know, who are going to take a test and they're going to get something really, really surprising. They're going to get something that upends their understanding of themselves, their families, their roots, their health histories, right? And the conundrum of this is that you don't know what you're going to get until you get it, and once you know it, it's too late to undo the knowledge. So, how do we kind of decide whether we want to walk into situations, and what do we do when we make those discoveries, right? And this just struck me as an absolutely kind of fascinating experiment that we are running in our own lives without even realizing it, right? It is technology shaping our most intimate selves, and we don't even know it. We're kind of bumbling into these discoveries, and these are moments of massive intergenerational reckoning, right? Moments where we kind of go, oh my gosh, I was never told how I came into this world. So I wrote this story for the Washington Post, and the story went viral, and it got reprinted in a bunch of places, and I started getting emails, and I got like an avalanche of emails. I got hundreds and hundreds of them from people all across the country who wanted to tell me about their story. They were saying basically, that was a great story you wrote, but like now let me tell you mine. It's really good. Right? I tested 3 months ago. I tested 3 years ago. This astonishing thing happened. I still don't even really know what to make of it. And I started getting on the phone with people, and I was deeply moved by these stories. I thought, this is sort of where we are at our most vulnerable in the construction of ourselves, right? And to discover at age 55 that you are not who you understood yourself to be, and that your most kind of intimate, trusting relationships with your parents, for instance, concealed this secret, right, about your own identity. It really, really blows people's minds. And I wanted to take all those stories, and I wanted to honor them, and I wanted to write a book that would look at this not as a phenomenon that affected a few people, but as a kind of a broad American phenomenon that was changing individual lives, that was changing American families, and that was frankly changing our culture in seismic ways.
So you talk about telling the story of ordinary people, and I guess the stories really turn out to be fascinating. You have the story of Alice Collins Plebec. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but that's kind of the framework for your book. So without spoiling the story, because it's really fascinating, but can you explain why her quest kind of provides such a good window into home DNA testing?
Yeah, absolutely. So Alice's story, so the Post review, right, said that it read like an Agatha Christie mystery. I chose Alice's story because I wanted a page turner. I wanted basically a whodunit. I am actually a fan of Agatha Christie novels and Tana French and all those kind of suspense. I love suspense fiction where they're solving a crime. And so I wanted a whodunit of an existential nature. I wanted a book where you were like, oh my gosh, what happens next? And you couldn't put it down, because I was aware that I was writing a book of mainstream science, right? And there's a science in there, there's industry stuff in there. I didn't want that to be too daunting for an audience that was primarily interested in, the human stories, which is actually my primary interest. So I wanted to power the book with a narrative that would keep you kind of turning the pages. And I found Alice, who is essentially like, if you're familiar with Agatha Christie novels, she's the Miss Marple of her own story, but like way cooler. And her story is great because she's a great character, because the story is so surprising, and also because it contains other stories within it. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So Alice is a genealogist when we meet her. She's in her late 60s. She's retired. And she decides to take a DNA test at Ancestry, which has just started offering a DNA test in 2012. And she does this not because she's wondering, who am I? Because she knows who she is. She knows she is Irish American on both sides. And she has a really strong sense of Irish Catholic identity. She comes from a large family. There are 7 Collins siblings. She takes the test because she wants to break through some brick walls. That's the term genealogists use when they get to that point where the paper records just kind of fail them, right? Or there ceases to be paper records, and they're like, okay, wait, who was my great-grandfather really? And so she's doing some research on one of the counties in Ireland. She's trying to trace back, some members of her family who emigrated from Ireland, and she's thinking, maybe the DNA is going to help me. I'll connect with my Irish cousins. So she takes this test, and the results come back, and they are not at all what she is expecting. They are suggesting that she is not as Irish as she believes herself to be. In fact, they suggest that she is half Ashkenazi Jewish. And Ashkenazi Jews are those of us from Central and Eastern Europe. And we have a unique genetic signature that's different from somebody whose forebears come from Ireland. So Alice is thinking, okay, well, probably Ancestry's test, which is new, it's still in beta testing. Probably like they just aren't ready for prime time yet, right? Like they haven't figured out the science yet. I'll take another test at 23andMe. I'm sure that will confirm what I all my genealogical work and everything I know myself to be. So she takes the test at 23andMe, and of course, you know what's coming because otherwise there wouldn't be a book. The second test confirms the results of the first, and that's when she realizes she has like a major league mystery on her hands and she has to unravel it. Um, what makes Alice's story so great is that she literally spent her entire career training for this moment without knowing for it. So, what I mean by that is she spent her whole life working with technology, with information, the management of information and little bits of data. Like she's somebody who you can give her a ton of data and she can make sense with it. She can work with developers and programmers to, develop systems to corral that data. And so she can think, both about the details and she can think about the big picture. She's really, really good at that. She's very, very math science oriented. And because she's an early adopter of new technologies, she was not at all kind of afraid of diving into the data and trying to make sense of it. So what she decides is to do is basically build a database of her own DNA. And she builds a database of every single overlapping, like basically genetic segment that overlaps with one of these cousins that she finds in the database, one of these cousins that she thinks may unlock the secret. And she then spends 2.5 years looking at these tiny chromosome segments, trying to figure out which one of these is going to be the needle in the haystack that is going to solve her mystery, that's going to help her understand, number one, where is the Ashkenazi Jewish genetic ancestry coming from? Is it her mother's side, her father's side? And number two, what are the circumstances by which it got there, right? Like, who is she? And what's fascinating about that is that she decides to go about this in a very methodical way and simply take the most likely theory, and if she can eliminate it, go on to the next second most likely theory. So she starts with the most likely theory, and that is that she's probably just not related to her dad. And if you look at people who take DNA tests right now and they get one of those ancestry, ethnicity estimate pie charts, and it's, half unexpected ancestry, in some cases, that is going to be the explanation. And that is a phenomenon known as a non-paternity event or not parent expected. It's the acronym is an NPE. Some people call it MPE for message attributed parentage experience. So there's a lot of acronyms for this, but there's a lot of acronyms because this is a very common experience. Within the world of DNA surprises, it's certainly one of the most common, if not the most common scenario that people face. So Alice explores this theory, but that's not the explanation. She's able to eliminate it. And she's able to eliminate every other possibility that would seem to be the most likely. So she's able to eliminate the possibility that she's adopted. She's able to eliminate the possibility that she's donor conceived. She's able to eliminate one of her last theories, which is this idea that maybe her people came from, her people were, hidden Irish Jews who hid their Jewishness or maybe converted their way out of that religion and that identity to assimilate, to escape discrimination, and they came over to the United States and they continued to hide it, right? And maybe that it was just all the time sort of this like incredible historical revelation that she was making. That wasn't true either. But what is, and eventually after all this years of research, she finds that the solution to her mystery goes back 100 years. And so one of the great pleasures of writing the book was getting to go back and do all this historical research going back a century. But what, her story allows me to do sort of as a narrative device is peel off and tell readers first, when we get to Alice exploring the possibility of a non-paternity event, what is non-paternity? What do non-paternity events look like? And I have a whole chapter called non-paternity events, looking at the phenomenon, how common it is, kind of where our terms come from for it. And then most importantly, many stories from the point of view of the children, the adult children who are making these discoveries, and the fathers. And I go through telling other stories. There's a story of a late discovery adoptee who just discovered she's adopted through taking a DNA test, which is really a searing revelation for her. There's a story of a guy who is told that he is Sicilian. through his mother tells him the fiction that he's Sicilian to protect him from the reality, which is that she is the product of a biracial relationship. Her father was Black, her mother was white, and she faced such discrimination as a biracial child growing up in a rural white area. She was bound and determined to not let her children suffer the same. So she told them that they were Sicilian, and they believed it. And here he is, 50 years old, having discovered that, in fact, he has significant sub-Saharan African ancestry, and trying to kind of work his way through his understanding of how that shifts both his identity and his understanding of race in America. So it's a personal reckoning and also a historical one. So there's all these kind of fabulous stories that that I get to tell, that I was honored to be able to report, that are also, that Alice's central narrative kind of allow me to unfold.
So, home DNA testing, a lot of people will give these test kits like for as a Christmas gift and stuff like that. So it's kind of like this curiosity holiday gift. But you can also have these like profound life altering revelations from the same thing. So how do you see those two things coexisting?
Yeah, it doesn't completely make sense, right? Because it's what struck me over and over was what a low investment purchase we are making. We think we are making, right? The technology, well, home DNA testing has existed for 21 years. And the kind of DNA testing we're talking about, which is autosomal DNA testing, has existed for about a decade. And autosomal DNA testing, by the way, if you're not familiar, you haven't taken a test, it's giving you two basic chunks of information. So one is it's giving you a database of relatives, people who have tested at the same company who are genetically related to you. And the company can tell that they're related to you because they can pick out the overlapping genetic segments that you and they share. And then it can surface them to you in this database and say, you are related to this person. And they can't always say exactly what the nature of the relationship is, but they can say the degree of relatedness. And then you can figure it out, right? And through some research, ideally. And that is very, very reliable. The other piece of information they're giving you is an ethnicity estimate. That's an attempt to capture where your various people came from 500 to 1,000 years ago. That is less reliable because it is an estimate and it's kind of an evolving science. And so it's going to vary from company to company. So anyway, this technology, which has been around for about 10 years, it was in its very, very beginnings when it first started 21 years ago, when there was a kind of different kind of DNA testing being offered. It was much cruder. It was much less kind of helpful for people to do research, and it was very much a niche product. It was also very expensive. And so for the first 10 years of its life, it was something that, really only very serious family history enthusiasts knew about, and even fewer would bother to do, right? And then it changes because autosomal DNA comes on the scene. That's incredibly useful. And it becomes, goes from something that is, just mainly appealing to genealogists to something that appeals to the casual consumer. And you start to see this rise, like Ancestry starts putting a lot of money into advertising. In 2016 and 2017, they put $100 million into advertising each year, right? And you totally have to know Ancestry ads. If you're familiar with DNA testing at all, it's because you've seen Ancestry ads, right? That's how most people kind of get familiar with it. There's 23andMe, they run a lot of ads too, but the Ancestry ads, to my mind, are really iconic. And they really capture this idea that there's all these kind of displaced, rootless Americans wandering around, wondering who they are, and they really want that pie chart. And it moves to this realm of the casual consumer about maybe 5-6 years ago, and it becomes the gift you get for the person in your life who already has everything, right? It becomes the thing you get because, it's on sale. It's on sale, and it is marketed to us as entertainment. And for most of us, we figure, well, it's only $69 or whatever it is on sale. We assume that the profundity of the results is going to match the level of investment, so that it's not going to be a big deal. But there is this mismatch for some people. For some people, they invest very little. They wait a few weeks, they get back their results, and then it's like a holy cow moment. It's like a holy cow, my whole life has been a lie moment. And that is where I wanted to sit with people, because I didn't think anyone was really studying this, right? There's news stories, and the reporting in magazine stories are really, really interesting about this phenomenon. But we often like leave people right after they've made the discovery, and then maybe they've gotten into some sort of reunion with their genetic relatives, and then we kind of leave them like, it's like, oh, it's good, they're done. It's not done. And as I would talk to people, 6 months after discovery, 1 year after discovery, 2 years, these are things that people are probably going to process, it seems, for the rest of their lives. It's a really, really big deal. And I can come back and talk about why it's such a big deal. But these are not one and done. The situations are very complex. The reunions are not always happy reunions. They're not always reunions at all. And so to really understand the 360 of these events, I thought was really important, and I think it's important to understand the bigness of the decision to test, even if it doesn't feel like a big decision.
So yeah, I think you're right that this has really become such, like, in a way, like a casual thing that people just do, and you just order the kit and give it as a gift or something like that. And so at this point, you say that over 37 million people, mostly Americans, because we're the ones that like don't quite know how to trace ourselves back as easily as
Exactly.
people in other countries. But you're saying that with this many people having taken the DNA test, America's kind of reached a tipping point. So what does that mean to you?
Yeah. So if I could show you the growth chart in DNA tests in the last few years, it would look like a really steep slope, and you wouldn't want to attempt to climb it. So when I was starting writing the book 4 years ago, there were 8 million DNA test kits that have been sold. And today, as you said, 37 million. And as you said, the majority of them Americans. Pew Research has done some studies showing that more than 15% of the US adult population has taken a mail-in spit kit DNA test. And that's, I'm focused on the four major companies, which are Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. And so that's where the 37 million number is coming from. There are other DNA tests and other companies that are smaller. And companies that existed and have gone out of business. If you took a national geographic test, 10 years ago, they're not offering those anymore. But in fact, there's more people than the 37 million. So the tipping point is an acknowledgement of the fact that the vast majority of Americans are potentially affected by this technology, even though they have not taken a test. What do I mean by that? I mean that the vast majority of Americans, whether or not they've taken a test, may discover something material and surprising about their own genetic origins, about their health, or about their roots, or about their family, because somebody else took a test. So, that means that in some ways, our decision to test or not to test is not as meaningful as you might assume, right? I talked to a bioethicist who said, basically, you don't get to opt out of this technology anymore. What did he mean by that? You can opt out in the sense that you're not paying the money and you're not taking the test. And there may be privacy issues involved in taking a test that you may be protected from because you have chosen not to test. So in some ways, your decision to test or not test is quite meaningful. But in terms of the privacy of the American family and the notion that secrets are going to stay buried, that is completely exploded, and the era of family secrets is over, right? You cannot assume if your child came into the world in a way that they don't know, right? Because they were conceived by sperm donor, for instance. You can't assume that they're not going to find out. They need only take a test, or their child takes a test. And there are certain pieces of information that can come out even through more distant relatives taking a test. So for instance, just to give you as an example, like let's say that I have a bunch of brothers, and let's say one of them conceived a child in high school at age 16, as is true for one of the men in my book that I write about. He conceived a child with a girlfriend. He didn't know it. His girlfriend didn't tell him. And then he grows up and he gets married and he has kids. And meanwhile, this daughter has grown up, and she wants to find her genetic father. He never takes a test. He's not in the database, but guess what? I am. And I am revealed to this niece of mine as her genetic aunt. And from that information, it is relatively easy to figure out, where she needs to go next. So she might contact me, or she might not contact me. She might just like look me up. And I live such a rich trail of breadcrumbs about myself online that she's going to quickly figure out exactly who I am, and that I have 3 brothers, and she's going to write a letter to 3 brothers, and then she's going to say in the letter, say, I think one of you is my father, right? And I also have a story in the book about that, like a man writing a letter to 3 fathers, right? And the fallout and how that kind of evolves. But for argument's sake, like I don't have to be the sister of the man in question. I could be a first cousin, a second cousin, even a third cousin. So there's been a lot of research showing that from third cousins or closer, in many cases, people can reliably identify someone not in the database. So think about all the third cousins that you have whose names you don't even know. You've never even met them because they're third cousins, and we don't often know our third cousins, right? But their decision to take a test impacts you. And that means that we have kind of gotten to this moment where we really need to be talking about, about all these issues, about all the things we were never told, about the ways we came into the world, the different shapes of a family, the non-standard shapes, and the fact that, the sort of standard shape was never really the way all families were formed in the first place. There's a whole kind of fascinating intergenerational conversation that is opened up now in this moment, and a kind of transparency that now we are a moment of transparency we're kind of being ushered into.
So when you're talking about most of these revelations, most of them are these NPEs or non-paternity events. And they can create so much upheaval and stuff like that. But how common would you say that they actually are?
Yeah, so there's been some research showing that it's probably between 1% and 2% of across populations. So that's like looking at different populations and kind of averaging it out. And if you take the 2 most common scenarios, which is discovering you're not genetically related to your father, or discovering you have a previously unknown sibling or half sibling, say because maybe one of your parents had a child before your parents got together, or one of your parents had a child outside of the relationship with the other parent. If you take those 2 together, it's conservatively in the low single digits, spread across 37 million people. It is at least 1 million testers. But that is not actually the true scope of it, because of course there are other kinds of revelations that are not encapsulated, right? Late discovery adoptees, people discovering their genetic roots were hidden because they were escaping from assimilation, like other, I have a first cousin who I didn't know existed because she was born and then placed for adoption, and now I am like learning and I know her. There's all sorts of scenarios. But also because each revelation ripples across many members of a family, right? We don't kind of contain that news. If I discover I'm not genetically related to dad, well, man, I may want to have a conversation with my mom, right? And I might wind up talking to my dad about it, and that might materially affect my parents' marriage, right? And then I'm also discovering that the siblings that I grew up with are my half siblings, and goodness, that might explain a lot of feelings of otherness and isolation that I experienced growing up. A lot of people say that, some people don't, but a lot of them say that this speaks to things that they long kind of wondered about, right? And then let's say 2 states away or 10 minutes away or on the other side of the country, there is a whole other family. And there is this stranger who contributed half of my genetic material. He is my biological father. I might want to know him. And in the act of reaching out, I am affecting also him, right? And his relationship with his wife. And now I'm discovering that I have these previously unknown half siblings who I might want to forge relationships with and make up for lost time. So each revelation ripples across easily 8 to 10 people. So you're talking about millions of consumers. And it is, I want to say, because I think it's important to say, it's not necessarily a bad thing. There are many, many situations where people are incredibly grateful to know. And so I am not someone who's standing here saying, this is like a cautionary tale and beware. I have a nuanced kind of attitude towards DNA testing as somebody who's done it and benefited a great deal from it, and has interviewed a lot of people who got surprises, but were ultimately grateful to know about those surprises. But that it's a bit of a Rorschach test within families. You'll have some people who are, depending on where they stand in relationship to a secret, incredibly grateful, and other people who wish that it had never happened, that the test had never been taken, and that clash of interests can be really really fascinating and kind of important to understand.
Yeah, there are definitely like a lot of really touching parts of the book where you see these people finding out that they had family members that they never knew about and forging these like amazing relationships with them, which is it's really cool. And you realize like they never would have known about this without the DNA testing. Um, what would you say the implications are for this home DNA testing, for how we like define the word family?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think it has, I think ultimately encouraging us to be more broad-minded about all the different ways that a family can be made and about all the different ways that somebody can be related to you, whether or not they're biologically related to you. And what I found as I was interviewing, I call them seekers. So I think, the seekers is a term I use to just kind of describe any of us who are using our genealogical research and DNA testing to kind of understand how our past has shaped our present, right? And I think we're kind of becoming a nation of seekers because this is a big genealogical moment for Americans. We've never been so into genealogy. There's never been a moment better to do genealogy. Like you can find so much more than you could even 5 years ago. But I also think that, having interviewed a lot of seekers, that we tend, I think, to think in somewhat binary terms about the relative influences of biology and experience, right? Or nature and nurture, as people know the terms. And we tend to rank them. We tend to say, which is the more important? And we tend to look for like the secret sauce that explains why we happen to gesticulate in a certain way, like where did I get that? Did I get that from my dad? Right. And that those questions really come into play with these stories about surprises, because people want to understand, it explains how I got this interest in science because I'm learning my biological dad is a doctor. And that is true. It's not imaginary. It is profoundly true that we are the product of nature in many ways, but we are also the products of nurture, right? We're both. And I think, having talked to a lot of people now, what I've kind of heard from them is that attempting to rank them, attempting to say which is the primary force, is a bit of a fool's errand, because it is both. And when people make a discovery that they have a biological father who is different than the person they thought of as their biological father, that doesn't mean that man ceases to be dad, but nor does it mean that they're not curious. And so that ability to contain both seemingly contradictory terms in your head, right? To maintain those relationships for which, in some cases, we don't even have language. Because what do you call that man who contributed half your genetic material, right? If you already have a dad, that nuanced position is, I think, very important to honor and recognize. That, okay, we may not have language, we may be limited in that way, but that doesn't mean that we are limited by our hearts, right? And you can seek out identity from understanding your biology just as surely as you can maintain your relationship with dad and know that you owe him more than you could ever give back, right? And so I think it may be ultimately pushing us towards thinking about, we've always known that family isn't just biology, right? We've always known that. And you can look back at ancient Rome and see the writings of a foster father who is talking about, his role in his son's life and how much he is permitted to kind of stand in as this child's father, right? Like how much ownership and how much kind of paternity claim does he have on this child he raised, despite the fact that he's not genetically related to him. So we've always been interested in these kind of questions of nature versus nurture. These are age-old, essential human questions. And I think what the DNA age does is make these questions very relevant and personal to lots of people. Um, and it encourages us to think about all the non-standard, I'm putting that in quotes, ways that families can be formed, that, that don't have to be kind of, they don't have to be black, and we don't have to think about them in black and white terms.
Okay, question, I'm sure, well, I think you mentioned this in the book, so I know the answer, but people might be wondering, have you taken a DNA test and what did you find out?
Yeah. So I've taken three. And you might be like, why would you take three tests? Your DNA stays the same. What's the point? But you do want to sometimes, if you're kind of crazy, take more than one test. And the reason is twofold. One is that you are going to find different DNA cousins in different databases, right? Because depending on where you test, maybe there's a long lost cousin in one and she's not in the other two that you're testing in. And so I was interested in that, and I was writing about it, of course, so I wanted to know about the different ways that you can experience the results. And then I was also interested in comparing my ethnicity estimates, which change all the time. This company's better than that one at predicting this company's better at predicting that. That stuff totally evolves. So I did take three tests, and we had like remarkable breakthroughs on both sides of my family that would never have happened if not for DNA testing. And that's why I say that I am kind of in I'm kind of I can't come at this as from the point of view of like, a cautionary tale. Like I think the immediacy of the results that you can get, the immediacy of the access to the past, right? To your understanding of how the past has been shaping you, even if you never knew it. I think that's mind blowing, right? And kind of just an astonishing moment that we're in. So just to back up, on my dad's side, we are a bunch of things, but part of what we are is Swedish. And his grandmother came over from the 1890s from Sweden. She was emigrating as a teenager. We didn't know, but she left some people behind. And the reason we didn't know it is because there was a kind of break in the line, an MPE. And so on paper records, we don't have living close cousins in Sweden, but in DNA terms, we do. So what happened is we found this cousin in one of the databases, and we started conversing with her. And her mother is my dad's second cousin. And it turns out she had done a ton of genealogical research. And after talking with her, in emailing back and forth for maybe a year or two, we decided we wanted to meet her. And we went to Sweden. And with the help of a local historian, we got to see the landscape of my great grandmother's life, like all that she left behind when she was fleeing from all this poverty in southern Sweden. So we got to see, the foundation of the farmhouse where she lived, the school that she attended, including some of the original desks were still there. So maybe a desk that she actually sat at, right? And kind of mind blowing. The church that she attended was still there. It was completely amazing. And then we sat down, and my dad and his second cousin, all of us together, we sat and we had fika, which is like, I'm probably mispronouncing it, but it's like the tradition of coffee and pastries. And she didn't speak English and he didn't speak Swedish. And it was like, this is totally amazing. And what blew my mind about this was like, a second cousin just doesn't seem that far away. You know what I mean? Like I know a lot of my American second cousins. Third cousins are another matter, but second cousins aren't that distant. And what it did was it made like the 1890s, and this impoverished moment in Swedish history when there was like no cars and no, I don't know if they had electricity, limited photographs. I mean, just a totally different time. It made that time kind of, or maybe it allowed me to rock it back to that time. And it made it feel so much more immediate. And that is kind of the lesson of DNA. And it's the lesson for me as a genealogist. It's the lesson for people who are finding surprises in their own genetic origins, is that the past, it isn't over, right? It's shaping us even now. It's sitting inside of our cells, and we need only crack it open to make these discoveries. And on my mom's side, I should say, we are Ashkenazi Jewish, and her grandfather came over, left siblings behind, never spoke about them. We never knew what happened. We kind of assumed that people passed away because there was the Holocaust. They were living in Ukraine as Jews. What were the chances that they survived? And we found my mom's second cousin in the database. And his family had survived in Ukraine through everything the 20th century had to throw at them: pogroms, the Holocaust, the rise of the USSR, and then he had eventually gone to Israel and then come to Brooklyn. And we were on the phone with him, and he was in Brooklyn, and it was like, holy cannoli, this is amazing. So I do think, there are times when DNA can allow us access to things that, the paper records alone, sometimes we can't get access to those things.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, even after reading the whole book, and you do go into a lot of the like privacy concerns, and there's definitely people who had bad experiences that maybe wish they could go back and like, okay, maybe I should never have known that, and I don't want to do, but it did not turn me off of wanting to do it. So do you have any advice for people who are thinking about doing a test?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, in general, when you take a test through one of these big companies, they give you like a kind of advisory. And the advisory says something like, you may discover unexpected relatives, or you may learn things that change your worldview or your understanding of your family. In my experience, those kind of advisories don't make a difference to people, because everyone that goes into this test assumes that they know what there is to know about their families, right? I mean, unless you're testing specifically because you have a question, which is another category of people. You don't know the identity of your genetic dad and you're looking for him, or you were adopted at birth and you're trying to figure out the identity of your birth parents and you're blocked because you can't access your original birth certificate. But for the people who who totally didn't see this coming, that advisory, they don't pay attention to it because it would require such a leap of kind of cognitive distortion, right? I mean, why would you think that you're about to find out something really, really surprising that's about something fundamental to you that you didn't know? You would kind of go crazy if you sat around entertaining such notions. So I guess I would say, the advice that I might offer is not actually for the people who are testing. It's actually for, an older generation of adults who may be in possession of knowledge about their children's origins that they have not revealed to those children. And I want to honor the fact that there are very, very good reasons why people didn't tell their children how they came into the world. It is folly to judge them by modern standards. There were profound stigmas. Sometimes these were matters of survival, or escaping great social ostracization. The notion of trying to be a single unmarried mother raising a child in, the 1950s. I mean, the isolation that you would experience. There were all sorts of reasons why people made decisions that they made. And there's often, I have found, for whatever reason, never the right moment to kind of break that to your child, right? And for whatever reason, when people decide to keep a secret, that secret acquires a kind of inertia. So it stays sort of suspended in amber through the generations or through the decades. And then the person takes a test and they're like very angry because they're like, how come you never told me? So the advice that I would give is to consider the possibility that this might be the moment to tell your child, because they're going to take a test at some point, or someone else is going to take a test. Their child is going to take a test. And it's inevitable that information is going to come out. And it is so much better for it to come from you than for it to come from a computer screen. That is going to kind of buttress your relationship, whereas finding out and then, from a computer screen and then having to go to your parents and say, what the heck, is going to fray the relationship. And that's not even encapsulating the possibility that you might pass away before your child makes the discovery, and then they can't ask certain really important questions to get context. So there are people now who are arising in this world to be psychologists, to people who are discovering DNA surprises, and to be mediators within families where there are family secrets, because this is such a widespread phenomenon, and they will hold your hand a little bit. And I would just urge people to consider the possibility that might be something to start thinking about how to do.
So I just wanted to ask if people are interested in buying a copy of your book, or if they're interested in what else you're finding out and they want to kind of stay in touch with you. Can you let us know how to do that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, so I have a newsletter. I send it out once a month, something like that. It's free. I don't sell it to anyone. But I write about DNA. I write about family secrets. I write about genealogy. If I've had like an op-ed on the topic, like I recently had an op-ed in the New York Times on the topic of DNA testing and race, I'll send it out. So that's at my website, which is libbycopeland.com. I'm going to put that in the chat, and you can sign up there. I'm supporting a local bookstore near me. So obviously, a lot of people like to buy their books on Amazon, and that's great. Or get it at their library, which is really awesome. If you want to buy a book and you want like a personalized copy, or you want to give it as a gift, there's an independent bookstore near my house, and I go by there and I sign books, and they'll ship them anywhere in the country. So I can make it out to people personally, which is kind of like a book tour thing in a pandemic age. So that is called the Village Bookstore. It's in Pleasantville, New York. And I'm putting all of that into the chat if you're interested in learning more.